It is our great pleasure to have Professor John Tomasi from Brown University with us today. John is a professor in political science and philosophy. He is the founding director of the Political Theory Project at Brown University, a research center which I have read is dedicated to furthering the study of ideas and institutions that might make societies more free, prosperous, and fair. John has a PhD from Oxford University, and he's also a renowned author of several books and journal articles. Other than his appointment at Brown University, John has held positions at Princeton, Stanford, and Harvard. His latest book, Free Market Fairness, in his latest book, John tries to combine or fusion some concepts that have traditionally been viewed as incompatible. Notably, John tries to fusion the concept of economic liberty as proposed by Friedrich Hayek, for example, with the notion of social justice as advocated by, for example, Rawls. So I, for one, look forward to hearing more about how this fusion works in practice from the author himself. Therefore, I'd like to bid you welcome, John Tomasi. The floor is yours.
So thanks for coming. I have an idea that I want to share with you, and I especially, without discriminating, wish to share it with those of you who are deeply attracted to free market ideas and who are younger than 35. Because I think the ideas I'm going to talk about are going to be hard to digest no matter who you are, but my hope is that perhaps those of you in that group will find them easier to swallow, or as I think of it myself, I may find you easier to hook. A warning before I begin. I'm a political philosopher, and so I'm going to roll some political philosophy on you. I'm aware it's late in the afternoon. Some of you have probably been doing intellectual things all day, so I'm going to roll the philosophy on you gently. It will not be painful. That is, it will not be painful unless you walked in here this afternoon having a political philosophy. And if you walked in here having a political philosophy, you may find a sense of pain growing in your mind as I speak. But if you find yourself feeling that pain as I speak, do not be alarmed. For what is pain? Pain is merely weakness, leaving the body. So for many years, decades, the train of political philosophy has lain frozen in a kind of a deep freeze. The divide among philosophers, among academic philosophers, my people, mirrors a divide in popular politics, a divide that's especially sharp in my country, in the U.S., a divide between parties of left and right. And among the academics, like among the citizens of my country, there's a yawning gap between these two parties. I think that as a frozen cove with one camp on one side and one camp on the other side, and this very cold wind blowing tufts of snow across the ice in between. And the wind picks up enough speed across that gap that not much communication can happen across it. Off one coast are some of you. Off one coast is the embattled camp of the classical liberals and libertarians. This was my camp for a very, very long time. And this is, as I picture the libertarians and the classical liberals, at least among the academy, we are hunkered down in tents with the wind blowing hard against the sides of the tents, flapping at the doors. But the libertarians have these stakes that have been pounded into the ice long ago, stakes that are really deep into the ice, things about self-ownership, for example. Locke put them there. They're going nowhere. And the libertarians actually kind of enjoy being down in that, hunkered down in their tents with that wind flapping against, because they know they can hold out, let the storms blow. In that camp of classical liberals and libertarians, they defend limited government and the ideal of voluntarism in human affairs. And they're very strong advocates of private economic liberty and property rights most of all. But in that camp, the phrase social justice is only rarely or dismissively heard. Across the cove on the other side, up on the high icy bluffs, is the camp of the modern, as they call themselves, the modern or egalitarian, or at their most enthusiastic, the high liberals. I picture them, this is the academically dominant camp, and if the libertarians in the academy live in tents, the high liberals live in very nicely constructed igloos that were blocked together in the early 1970s by this guy named John Rawls. And in those igloos, as I picture them, they have heaters, and they have flat-screen TVs, and they have abundant furs, faux furs. And in this camp, in that camp, their battle cry is social justice, or perhaps, when they're being sloppy, social justice now. And they advocate a government of expansive powers in pursuit of that moral requirement of social justice. But they're highly skeptical of private economic liberties of capitalism. Some of them are, as they call themselves, reluctant capitalists only. This is the party that gives philosophical firepower, such as it is, to popular movements such as Occupy Wall Street. Here's the first little touch of philosophy. I think I can make this thing work. It's not so bad. So the divide between the tent people, there's two tents, and then the much bigger camp, though they only get one line, of high liberals. That divide among the philosophical schools, that divide among these two parties, is rooted in an earlier divide about a disagreement about the moral conception of personality. So philosophers, whether they admit it or not, or whether they're more or less self-conscious about it or explicit about it, when they answer the question, the political question, how ought humans to live together, they usually are relying upon assumptions they make about what it is that humans are. After all, if you're going to answer the question, how should people live together, you probably need to stake some claims of what a person is. And what you're going to see now in a moment is that this divide out here between the Tea Party people and the Wall Street Occupy people is generated by a divide back here. And I'll just simplify and leave the classical liberals out of it, even though I'm a big classical liberal fan, but I'll just to make this point, I'll leave them out of it for now. I'll come back to them soon enough. But this party, for example, I'll just show you how this works with the personality stuff. This is a line of reasoning rooted, I suppose, at least in John Locke. There are people before John Locke, but let's just go with John Locke as the fountain of this movement. And Locke, as some of you know, said that what people are, really, they're self-owners. Because we're beings who own ourselves. The familiar Lockean argument that we own ourselves, we own our labor. If we own our labor, we can mix our labor with unknown things out there in the world and come to own those things. And so Locke said, if you want to know how to do politics, we should think about natural rights people have, what rights they have and liberties they have in the state of nature before their society. And we reason this idea about owning things, about the earth being given to man for man's own benefit, and Locke's idea that earth is given most of all to the industrious ones, because the industrious ones make the best use of God's creative act. And you sort of reason through this naturalistic way to the question now finally, well, what should the state be like? And if you think that God gave the world to the industrious ones most of all, and if you think that among the most natural, most clear natural rights people have in the state of nature is a right to property, where you pick an apple and eat it just to survive, that's a property right in Locke's view, then when it comes time to ask what should the state be like, it's not surprising that this party says, well, the state should protect these natural rights. And so for Locke, Locke says maybe the most important thing the state should do is to protect property rights. So reasoning from this conception of the person, naturalistically, through the state of nature and natural rights, it's not surprising that libertarians, following Locke, come up with this idea that the state should protect economic liberty or property rights. And that's the theory of Robert Nozick, Murray Rothbard, Ayn Rand. The little twist up here is that there's another school that's a little bit less absolutist about the rights, the classical liberals, Adam Smith, Hayek, perhaps, Mises, and they tend to argue in a more econometric ways, but leave those aside for now. So just notice that's one justification behind the tent dwellers. Across the divide, across the windswept sea, up on that cozier bluff, well, little igloos are, lots of igloos, and there's so many igloos in the academy. They're everywhere. High liberals are just everywhere. So in America, if you threw a snowball down the hallway of any major department of philosophy, you couldn't help but hit a high liberal upside the back of the head. It's just, they're everywhere. On that side, they start differently. When they start asking about what politics should be like, they begin not with the idea of a self-owner or a happiness maximizer. Rather, they begin with the idea of the democratic citizen. And this is a tradition that has lots of different roots going into it, but I think of it as Rousseauian from Rousseau. And the idea is that a citizen, and Rawls is going to pick it up too, the idea is that a citizen, oh, it's over there. Okay. Can't do that. That's too weird. That's like a parallel universe. He's opposed to social, okay, anyway. So the democratic citizen is thought of as a being. This is another conception of moral personality. It's a being with two moral powers. First, the ability to set up a plan, the ability to identify and pursue a plan of life for oneself. So the democratic citizen is thought as being a being, describes us as being beings, each of whom has a life to lead. And our life is incredibly important to each of us. After all, it's our life. On the other hand, or in addition, this school says, along with recognizing the importance of our own lives to ourselves, each of us as citizens can recognize the importance of each of our fellow citizens' lives to them. After all, they're their lives. So the democratic approach begins with this composite conception of the citizen with these two moral powers. And just for the libertarian in the group, just note that recognizing that one's fellow citizens have a life to lead does not ipso facto mean you should become a slave to them. On this approach, we have this sort of a problem now to figure out how do we negotiate recognizing the importance of my life to me and my ability to recognize your life as matters to you. So from that approach, they reason in a different way. They're not just imagining people in the state of nature. Rather, they're imagining people as citizens facing this complicated question, how do we live together and give honor to the importance of your life to you, your freedom, along with honoring your capacity to recognize the importance of your fellow citizens' lives too. So they reason deliberatively, or if you like, public reason, or sometimes they say constructivistly. And when they reason together, as they call it, as they think they're doing, as they reason deliberatively together, one of the things they come up with is the idea that if we're going to have a political system, it's got to be acceptable to everyone. Everyone, at least, well, there's some qualifications as to what that means, but everyone in general has to accept it. That is, they affirm something like the idea that political system should affirm social justice, the idea that no one should be left behind. So you can see, and this is kind of a long way to get to the point is that this divide out here, this familiar divide between the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, or between the libertarians and the high liberals, is rooted in a fundamental disagreement about the character of moral personality itself. And you can't adjudicate that dispute until you can adjudicate this one. And you can't adjudicate this one. When I went to graduate school at Oxford, I thought to myself, cool, I'm going to hang out with some philosophers and we're going to figure this out. When I got there, I was surprised, because I was naive, I was surprised to find that, in fact, no one was going to do that. Because every conversation we would try to have out here was infected by the awareness that whichever side wins here is going to win out there too. So it was impossible, at least in my experience, to have a serious conversation about this because of the ideological latentness of the conversation. The result of all this, to get to them, is what I call the moral status quo. We have this divide across the coves because of this problem about moral personality. And there's no middle ground between the two sides. Economic liberty or social justice. Capitalism or democracy. Hayek or Rawls. Tea Party or Occupy. Free markets or fairness. One side or the other. Everyone's got to choose. I see your hand, but I'm just going to keep going. I'll take questions when I finish. Okay. A little bit more. So I'm not very happy with this state of affairs. And I'm part of a group, there's a bunch of us who are trying to change it, trying to move it around. And it can be done in a whole bunch of different ways. The way I do it, well, it can be done in a bunch of different ways. In my case, I'm really drawn to economic liberty. And there's lots of reasons to be in favor of economic liberty. Some of them are practical, about efficiencies, perhaps, economic growth. Some of them are more strategic in the sense of economic liberties protecting other rights and liberties. Without economic liberties, how do you have freedom of the press and so on? But there's an inner core argument for economic liberty that I find in Rand. At least there's a glimmer of it inside Rand that I really, really like. I don't like some of the way she presents it, but the idea that I love within economic liberty is the thought that one of the reasons why economic activity is important is because people define themselves and say who they are by the choices they make in the economic realm. That is, that economic activities is a domain of liberty itself. So there's some, you might say, intrinsic worth to the exercise of economic liberty. People become who they are and express their values in part, just in part, but in part, by the choices they make in the economic sphere. Ordinary choices about saving, about spending, about what career you embark upon, what you decide to do with your life regarding the economic aspects of your choices. Those choices are not the only domain in which we express ourselves, but they're an extremely important domain. They're just as important, I think, perhaps, to most people as religious questions and associative questions. There's an aspect of ourselves that gets picked up by economic liberty distinctively. However, just when I'm honest about it to myself, as I became honest about 3 or 4 years ago, finally, thinking about these debates, I like this ideal better. Now, I can never say that before because I was taught that if I say this, then I got to be this. And I ain't that. I'm this. But I think this is the most attractive way to reason. And yet it seems to me that if you take this, so I sort of built a little icebreaker in my book. Built a little icebreaker. It used to be tied up outside the libertarian tent. And I loaded up some of my libertarian, well, baggage, but stuff that I like, insights. And I put the libertarian insights about economic liberty onto my icebreaker. Actually, you people probably actually know what icebreakers are. I don't. Anyway, and then I chuck across the frozen sea, chook, 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 over here. And I go up to the igloos, and I smash into them very gently, very nicely, but pretty solidly, just enough to crack up, I hope, all the ice beneath their Ugg-covered feet. So that we democratic citizens now can look down together at common ground, but it's also kind of broken up common ground. Sorry, the metaphor's falling apart. And reason together. And we ask a new set of questions that haven't been asked by the democratic reasoners of the past. Because these guys all shared the same bias against economic liberty. Among the questions I ask now, from a democratic perspective, are these. First, is deliberative democracy really a vehicle that can only make left turns? Once we agree to reason together and to leave no one behind, does that really require that we have to go like this all the time? By what engineering theory would anyone think it's plausible to believe that a mere commitment to respect one another requires leftist institutions evermore, even hard left turns? Why is that? Why is deliberative democracy, or is it a vehicle that only makes left turns? More precisely, slightly more precisely, do we really best respect our fellow citizens as responsible authors of their own lives by seeking to use the state to limit their private economic liberty? Do we really best respect our fellow citizens as responsible self-authors by trying to curtail their economic activities? I don't think so. And in the book, I work on an account of liberal justice that tries to combine the uncombinables: democracy and capitalism, Rawls and Hayek, Occupy and Tea Party, free markets and fairness. And I'll just mention that when I was first working on this a few years ago, part of my idea was to try to revive classical liberalism. And it's been classical liberalism that's given defenses in the last century by mainly economists, people like Hayek and Mises, Milton Friedman, Richard Epstein more recently. But all those utilitarian arguments seem to me to be not as powerful as the public reasons ones are. So my thought is to take what seems to me to be an institutionally sensible idea, strong but limited property rights, limited government as opposed to no government. I know, but this appeals to me more. And then put it on the more secure democratic foundations, or if you like, take classical liberalism and the concern for economic liberty and return it to the foundations that Kant originally put it on. So move it back to this more powerful formulation. When I wanted to give a name to it, I came up with this name. Jason Brennan and I, a friend, came up with this one, neoclassical liberalism, because it was classical but new. Now, you know, it sounds like neocon, which I probably am not. It sounds ugly. I mean, neoclassical liberal. Is that going to catch on? About the same time I attached myself to that label, a friend of mine started the blog, Bleeding Heart Libertarians. Have some of you seen that blog? It's a great blog if you haven't seen it, called Bleeding Heart Libertarians. They talk a lot about this project combining economic freedom and social justice, but they also sell T-shirts and coffee mugs, and they basically completely taken over the label, so I'm stuck with that, but everyone calls this thing bleeding heart libertarianism. Okay, how do you get there? How do you get to a democratic argument that will not just run down the familiar track to this and attack this, but will rather affirm this and affirm a new understanding of this? How do you get something like neoclassical liberalism? Well, I work through a conception of fairness. Where's this thing? Oops. Okay. So there's an idea in political philosophy that's become very powerful in recent decades. The idea that justice should be thought of as fairness. And here's a formulation of it. We should regard as the most desired order of society the one we would choose if we knew that our initial position in it would be determined purely by chance, just as the fact of being born into a particular family. And just pause to see the power of this idea, the moral power of this democratic ideal. The idea is that if you want to know which type of social system, socialist, capitalist, whatever it might be, which type of social system you want that would be the most fair, the most just one, we should imagine ourselves evaluating those social systems from behind a kind of a veil making us ignorant about who in particular we're going to be in that society, whether rich or poor, black or white, talented or not talented, industrious or lazy. If we would pick the society from behind that veil, we'd get to the most just society. Some of you do political philosophy. Does someone know whose idea this is? Who? Is that they teach you people in Denmark? So this is true. Sorry, it's true, right? Those of you who said Rawls, that's right. Rawls did say something like this. But this is from 30 years before Rawls. Rawls said that in 1971. This is from 1940. And this is by Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek, the great enemy of Rawls, remember we were trying to unravel the story to get to the bottom of it. Now this is my first little move. Hayek is in London during the bombing, and it's getting bad. Right, they're bombing them. They're being bombed. And Hayek sends out letters around the world for places, people to say, "You take my kids." The bombing starts to get worse, and Hayek thinks to himself, you know what, I'm probably going to be killed. And my kids, wherever they grow up, are not going to grow up with the benefit of having a Nobel Prize-winning economist father. How did he know then? Who knows? Let's pretend he did. The crucial point was the Hayek started thinking from a practical experience, he later reports, that maybe that's a kind of a test for fairness. And he looked at a variety of societies, thinking about where he might want to send his kids to safety. And he used this kind of a test to think which is the fair one. He chose the United States, by the way, but it's an interesting little twist on that. He chose the United States, but he said that he only chose the U.S., this is 1940, he only chose the U.S. because he did know one thing about his kids. He knew that they were going to be white, not black. And he says, in fact, that if he had not been able to know if his kids would be black or white, he wouldn't have chosen the U.S. because the conditions of African Americans was so bad in the U.S. in 1940. I just mention that because when Hayek was doing this and using this model, he was actually doing it Rawls on through. He was doing the same kind of reasoning that Rawls calls people upon 30 years later, and reasoning in a moral way, in a foundational way. I'll add also that because Hayek came up with this, some of you probably know, Rawls called his device the original position. But it wasn't. Hayek's is the original position, which renders Rawls' position the unoriginal position. And if you do nothing else just to infect you, please from now on refer to Rawls' unoriginal position. If you reason from Hayek's original position, what do you get? If you reason this way, if this is the right kind of test for justice, what do you get? Well, Hayek does not do it this way, and neither does Rawls, but here's what I get. Two things now that I want to make I need for the ship to go, or whatever. Two things for the argument to work. First, a democratic argument for economic liberty. Remember now, I've given up, I've gone away from my old friends, some of you probably. I've steamed away from my happy foundations for property rights. No more. It's sad, but I've actually gotten over them. I'm down here now. So I need a democratic argument for property rights. And second, I need an account of social justice, of distributive justice, that's compatible with affirming very strong property rights. That second one's a little bit of a problem, right? Because usually people on the left think, certainly, the traditional social justice crowd thinks, that to have social justice, you have to attack capitalism. You have to attack property rights. Because if you don't attack property rights and minimize them and shrink them down, if you don't attack them, you can't have social justice because you need a big state to get social justice. You can't have all these redistributive programs that are part of the familiar story about how we get social justice. So for me to make this thing go, I need a democratic argument for economic liberty plus a conception of social justice that's compatible with economic liberty. And by the way, I'll just add, I want even something more than that. I want an account of social justice and distributive justice that's more attractive than the account given by the left. So I want an account of social justice not just to stand up as a rival to theirs, but to stand up and to be judged more morally attractive than theirs, a better account, a more attractive account, a more inspiring account of what it means to live in a society that's fair. So that's what I'm after. So let me say a word about both of those steps. I won't give it all to you, but I'll give you some of it so you get some sense of how I do it in free market fairness. Economic liberty first. So first, the democratic argument for economic liberty. I guess most of you guys know, I hope speaking at CEPOS I can assume you know, that traditionally liberals thought that economic liberties were among the most important rights and liberties. That historically, liberals have always thought, long thought, that along with the civil liberties and liberties of religious freedom, property rights are right up among them as among the most important, if not the most important. So traditionally, liberals have formed a thick conception of private economic liberty. But as I read this story, starting around 1850 or so, things started to change. And I sort of picked Mill as my, culprit, I suppose. And Mill, reasoning in 1950, said that, the various activities that we do that make us individuals, that make us the kind of unique creatures that each of us at our best might be, those things are things that we do in our artistic lives and in our intellectual lives and in our private lives, our musical lives. They're not things we do when we actually work. Mill was an aristocrat. He thought that working was something that people do because they need to do it. He didn't see work itself, maybe the kind of works he saw around him in 1850, as being a domain of freedom in and of itself, an expression of who we are in itself. So too, following that Millian line, John Maynard Keynes, writing in 1929, wrote this brilliant short essay. Some of you may know it. It's called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Has some of you read that? You read it? Can I just really recommend that you Google Keynes' Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. It is, I think, the best window into the mind, the inner workings of the left that you can find. In that essay, whatever you think of Keynes' economic views, he's a masterful writer, just a fabulously gifted writer. And that essay, I think, is one of his best. In that essay, though, Keynes says, look, okay, he's writing in 1929, it's a bad time economically, a very bad time economically. But Keynes says, don't worry. things are actually really good economically speaking. And Keynes says, in fact, things are so good that within 100 years, 2030, by the time his grandkids are around, Western societies are going to be 8 times wealthier than they were then. Not a bad prediction, maybe a little short, but not a bad prediction. And crucially, Keynes says, when that happens, when we become 8 times wealthier, roughly now, the economic problem will have been solved. So this problem, how to have enough, which has driven us, or it says ridden us, hag-ridden us, humans, for thousands of years, will finally be solved. And when that day arrives, when the dawn breaks on the day of enoughness, 2030, 2029, I guess, those bourgeois virtues and attitudes, those ideals we've encouraged in our youth for hundreds of years, certainly in capitalist formations, ideals of hardworking, of thrift, of industry, of denying oneself now and delaying gratification for investment purposes, of seeking to have a better life for your kids than your parents could make for you, of constantly striving and acting and trying to become more than what we are now and have more than what we have now and know more than what we know now. All that constant kind of economic strivings will be revealed for the vices they've always been. In fact, Keynes calls them morbid neuroses. And he suggests that when the day of abundance arrives, when those who keep striving for more economically should be consigned to mental institutions for correction. And there's some really cool footnotes that I'll leave you to interpret. But as I read the footnotes, he is especially concerned about the Jews. He thinks the Jews may have these bourgeois attitudes a little bit too deeply entwined in their fiber for mere institutional correction. And then maybe they did something a little more deep, as I read the footnotes at least, maybe differently, something like religious correction. And he thinks that perhaps Christ will be the answer to solve that Jewish problem. But read that for yourself. The important part of that is that Mill to Keynes and then Rawls follow that same line. When Rawls finally comes in 1970 One, to write his list of basic rights and liberties, economic liberties hardly appear at all. They've just by then sort of dropped off the list. And that divide, though, when Mill and Keynes and Rawls, that strand of thinking, start questioning economic liberty, we find that that's really a crucial divide within liberalism. The crucial divide that generated these two sides of society, of otherwise liberal societies like the US, the Tea Party people and the Occupy people, they're really divided because of those intellectual strands. That Millian idea, or Lord Keynes looking down his long aristocratic nose at those bourgeois virtues, those ideas, and Rawls too, those ideas are what broke the society up, started this big divide that runs us back to those conceptions of the person I described before. And my idea in free market fairness is to challenge that, and to challenge it on their own terms. And one of my main insights from how I personally came to this idea was that thinking about feminism. And I was reading a few years ago I became really a maniac about 19th century feminism. And the 19th century feminists had this really interesting idea, fundamental idea, I think. They said that women especially, not only women, but especially women, were saying that, look, in patriarchy, women are placed in a nice glass house. And they're like a gilded cage, if you like. And things are being provided for them. All the gilded material means in the world are being provided for women. So, for example, they have their little golden swing that they can sit on like birds and swing when they want to swing. They have a little cup where there's water they can peck in and drink their water. There's another little cup where there's seeds, and they can crack the seeds and chew them, and people will come and replace the seeds and keep the water clean and so on. But no matter how gilded, no matter how nice the cage is, no matter how clean the water is, no matter how many seeds are available to you, if women's economic freedoms have been denied, there's something fundamentally wrong with that situation. Something fundamental disrespect that's done to women in conditions of patriarchy that zero in on economic issues. That's not the only lack of rights women had, clearly, but that economic right crucially made women vulnerable in two ways. First, they didn't have the material stuff, the way the classical liberals talk about the importance of rights to protect other rights. But more important within that literature, women seem to think and to perceive that that if they're not given the chance to be causes of their own lives, causes of there being water available to them, causes of there being seeds available to them and their families, that in some sense they've been disrespected. So I take that feminist insight that people want to be causes of their own economic experience, and I turn it and apply it against the traditional social democratic ideals. So those ideas of a good society being one which provide things for people, I think, is similar in interesting ways to that patriarchal idea that patriarchy is good for women because they are given all this stuff. And a set of citizens, perhaps some social democracies of the Nordic type, circa 1970 at least, in an idealized sense, treats citizens the way patriarchy treats women, and denies something essential about their personhood and their freedom that's morally worrying, no matter how pleasant and nice it might be in that cage. So that's kind of a moral insight. And then, I sort of, there's a couple other ideas I will sort of weave into that account that I give in the book. Some of my own experience watching college kids. I spent a lot of time teaching at college. I see a lot of college kids. And I just watched what happens. I watched what happens to my students as they go from being freshmen and sophomores, kind of happy-go-lucky, take what I want, a little art history, a little this, a little that. I could be anyone in the world. Life's easy and wonderful, relatively easy and wonderful, playful at least. Then they start getting grim. Right? Halfway through junior year, they start thinking, oh yeah, I actually have to leave this place at some point and go out in the world. I'm going to be transplanted now out into the world, away from this nice hothouse I was in for years. But the question is, what am I going to grow into? Who am I going to be? What am I going to do? What's my job going to be? What's it going to say about me 20 years from now that I chose that path rather than that path? And I watched this grim process occur in young people's lives when they go from their junior year to their senior year. They've actually now committed themselves to a course of life, at least beginnings of one. And what they're doing, I think, unpleasant though it may be to see, is they're growing up. They're crossing that threshold from childhood or, say, late adolescence into adulthood. And they cross that threshold just because they're now being required to think, and insofar as they're being required to think of themselves as economic authors of their own lives. And so again, I think that a citizenry that was denied that chance to cross that threshold, or for whom the passage of the threshold was insulated in very many ways, might be disabled from an important part of the process of becoming an adult. There's more I can say about that. That's enough, I think, to give you the sketch of what I'm looking at, the argument I try to give for economic liberty. But what about the other side, social justice? How am I doing for time? Have any idea?
You have 10 minutes or something.
Okay, social justice in 10 minutes. Easy.
Give and take.
Not so easy. I mean, roughly. So as I said, if you affirm very powerful economic liberties, as I think we must as a matter of democratic legitimacy, and again, the idea there is that if we're going to our requirement of democracy is that we respect the capacity of our fellow citizens to live lives on their own terms, just like we ask them to respect our capacity to live our lives on our terms. And the thought is that part of what it means one of the domains of activity in which people must be respected if they're going to be viewed as equal authors of their own lives is the economic domain. Liberties of working, liberties of owning. I could parse them out more precisely if you like in the Q&A. So you must protect those property, those economic liberties. But now the question is, right, well, if you do that, you're going to tie the hands of, as my colleagues on the left would say, of well-meaning legislators who want to make the world a better place for people. That is, you're going to tie the hands of legislators who want to pursue social justice. So the challenge now for a market democracy is to figure out, well, how can you get a conception of social justice, of fair shares, a fair distribution of shares, that's compatible with those strong economic liberties? If we respect our fellow citizens the way I describe, haven't we just prevented the state from doing all the good stuff we also want it to do, supposedly? We want to have good things we want to have done. They did that no one be left behind. So let me say something about that. I'm going to start with something kind of weird, but I think you'll see the power that once I get it out. There's a philosopher's question, and the question is something like, what's a theory of justice a theory of? Or, what's a theory of justice a property of? And the idea is that when you have some device like this Hayekian original position, Hayekian / Rawlsian original position, what you do is you reason through this device of representation, is what the philosophers do, and what comes out at the end, clunk, if you're lucky, is a measuring device. It's a measuring device that has little metric marks on it. Well, who knows what they are? The marks on it, and we're going to apply it to see whether something's just or unjust. And the philosophical question I'm asking now is, well, what do we apply it to? If we crank this machine and we get the measuring stick, now the philosophical question is, what do we measure? What do we measure? And here's one answer that's wrong. We might think you measure the actual holdings in society at any given moment. That a theory of justice, if we had one, a theory of social justice, if we had one, a theory of fair shares, would be the kind of thing we would take and slap onto Danish society right at this instant, who's got what, or slap it onto American society right at this instant, who's got what. For a whole variety of reasons, that can't be right. Rawls, in an early article, and this is Rawls from the left, in an early article in 1963, gave a technical explanation why it can't be right. And his answer is that if we're reasoning this way with the attempt to produce a measuring stick that could apply to a society at any given moment, there would be no solution to the problem. For all those kind of interesting techie reasons, you can't solve the problem of what the marking should be on this measuring device if the device is meant to apply to society as it is. A more colorful way of explaining that was given by Robert Nozick, his famous Wilt Chamberlain example. Some of you know that example? So briefly, the idea is that Nozick, the critic of Rawls, says, if you have a society that's completely just, all the distributions are the way that you think it should be, now you leave people to be free for a little while, they'll engage in trades and they'll live their lives and do things, and wealth will get moved around. In other words, it'll mess up your ideal pattern by definition. You give money to Wilt Chamberlain to watch him play basketball, or whoever it is these days. And at the end of the year, Wilt Chamberlain has a lot of money, other people have less money, so you need to get justice again, you slap it all around and move everything around again. So if justice is a property of actual holdings at any given moment, at any given time slice, justice is going to be a constant war with human nature. Justice is going to be, social justice is going to be a constant war with freedom. Therefore, in facing that problem, people like Rawls and Hayek, by the way, Hayek in his book called The Mirage of Social Justice, which is an extended attack on social justice, on page 100, at the end of the most important chapter, Attacking Social Justice, he says, and by the way, despite you may think, I actually agree with Rawls on the basic problems here. What? You just attacked social justice for 100 pages. Then you say, but I'm actually with Rawls. The footnote to that comment on page 100 goes to the early article of Rawls, where Rawls makes this point about how you can't find the solution. So justice has to apply to not, here we are, here's the important point, it applies not to actual distributions at any given moment, but rather it applies to, it's a property of, the basic structure of society as a whole. So we ask, Rawls and Hayek say, when we ask questions about social justice, we ask this question, not who's got what, but rather, how does the whole economy, this whole economic system, the whole constitutional structure, maybe some family structures too, the basic components of society viewed as a whole, how does it tend to operate over time, say over the course of a generation or two? And we evaluate then that metric's going to apply to that whole structure of institutions, how it tends to operate over time, over the course of, say, 50 or 75 years. That's what justice is going to be applied to. Notice, already, perhaps you see it, if Rawls is right, if Rawls and Hayek are right, the justice applies to that whole structure, not to individual holdings at any given moment, then social justice now is nonsense. The claim is social justice. That means taking a realistic look, a realistic long-term look at the likely effects of the various policies we might impose right now, or put in our society right now, and ask holistic questions about where we're going if we go this way in 30 or 40 or 50 years. So that's the first move to see why social justice might be compatible, in fact, may be required, by people who affirm property rights. Here's the second step. And this is, I'll do this in homage to Margaret Thatcher, who passed away yesterday. One of my favorite, maybe my favorite politician, except for maybe Anders Borg. But, well, sorry, that's an aside. Margaret Thatcher, if you want to see Margaret Thatcher at her best, in my opinion, you may remember when Margaret Thatcher came into power, she had a copy of the Constitution of Liberty, pounded on, this is what we believe. But at her best, I think, was her final question time. Has any of you have you seen her epic final question time? If you go to YouTube and just look up, Margaret Thatcher at her best, or Margaret Thatcher rides again, or Margaret Thatcher defeats socialism, you'll see what I'm about to do in her honor. So this is actually the example Margaret Thatcher gives. She gives in her final, so she pounds on Hayek's book when she began her reign, and now in her last moment, her final and best shot, parting shot, she goes all Rawls. And she has a Rawlsian argument. She doesn't know it, I don't think, but she has this totally Rawlsian argument. This is what she does. Her fingers are better than mine, but she says this. So I said before, justice is going to apply to institutions viewed holistically across a generation or two. That's one now sort of opening move. But now the question is, what's on the metric? What's on the metric? What do we measure? If that's what the thing applies to, what do we get out of this kind of thing? What exactly are the marks on the measuring stick? And here's two answers. Now here's the Thatcher part. You might think that what the measuring sticks are, imagine a society where holdings over time of the law across generations tend to be producing outcomes about like this, pretty equal, as opposed to a society that over time produces an outcome like this, pretty unequal. And along with Thatcher, now we can ask ourselves, well, which society is more just? Which society is more fair? Which of these two societies is going to better express our commitment that no one be left behind, that we respect all our citizens as authors of their own lives and treat them with respect? Which of these is better? Do you have a thought? You might think this one. After all, they're more equal, right? But remember, this society now, people may spend a lot of time thinking about who's got what. They focus a lot of their energy in their public conversation about who's got what and impose rules and norms to keep it as close as possible, because that's what they care about. What's more, if you look at that line I talked about before, the skeptics of economic liberty, Mill through Keynes to Rawls, they all share another idea that I didn't mention. They all share this really important idea. They're skeptical of economic growth. So each of those three authors, each of those three thinkers says that one of the ideal outcomes for a just society, and maybe the only structure in which we can achieve justice, is in a condition of no growth. So Mill, for example, talks about the stationary state economy, the slow or no growth society. And Keynes thinks that we can reach something like the day of abundance, and actually economic growth should stop at that point. And to want more would be a sign of a morbid neurosis. They thought that at a certain point, enough's enough. These guys now, let's imagine, don't think so much about those questions. They're entrepreneurs. They're happy with people doing new things and doing more. They think the economic problem is not a problem to be solved, but a problem to be lived, a way of being in the world, constantly creating new things, constantly opening up new horizons that even now we can't even imagine what they might be. Now again, apply that test that I said through time. Let's say these guys affirm the stationary state or something like it, so they grow a little bit. These guys, they go gangbusters. They're totally into economic growth. They're happy they're not reluctant, they're happy capitalists. So over time, let's say it goes like this. And I've had longer fingers, I can make the inequalities even wider if you like. Now again, Thatcher's question, Rawls' question too. Which society is more fair? Which set of social institutions best expresses our commitment to respect all our fellow citizens? Which of these two societies best respects the idea that no one should be left behind? Which best affirms the Rawlsian commitment to choose as just the social system which maximizes the benefits to the least well-off? Watch my thumbs. Right? So the least well-off here are doing better than the least well-off here. And Rawls argues, if you really care about justice, we don't just ask these relational questions, we ask about the least well-off. So it might be the case in a society which affirms capitalism and goes for growth, perhaps with some tweaks, all the classical liberalism, that you get more growth, that you affirm growth as an ideal, that this is the more just society, the way Thatcher thought Britain was at the end of her reign compared to Britain at the start of her reign. So you can see, just from that little bit perhaps, there's more, I'll leave it with that I'll leave it mainly with that there's space for an account of social justice which follows the Rawlsian and Hayekian technical arguments, seeing justice applying holistically across time, emphasizing the condition of the least well-off. There's space for a conception of capitalism which emphasizes economic liberty and emphasizes economic growth. Inside the social democratic argument, there's other reasons to think that they affirm other ideals like workplace democracy as being more important to people than having more personal wealth. There's a big divide in there we can talk about if you like, but on what I call a market democratic interpretation of social justice, people on my side unambiguously think that the best way to benefit the poor is to have an economic system in place which generates the most amount of wealth for them, for their personal control over time. On the other side, people tend to think, in fact, that rather than having the poor have more and more wealth, they're worried about wealth itself. They think that people should be changed, in fact, to care more about democratic participation. So they want the democratic workplace rather than wealth. I think you respect the poor not by giving them more chances to vote in the workplace, clang, clang, another meeting, but rather we best respect the poorest among us for trying to arrange our economic structures so that over time, each of them can control the largest possible bundle of wealth. Let me conclude with this. So this is what I think happened. And this is why so many classical liberals and libertarians get really uneasy about social justice. I call it a kind of allergy. In the book, I have a whole chapter called Social Justicitis, where I try to explain why it is that so many of my fellow tent people hate the idea of social justice, and they get sort of this allergic reaction when people like me start saying nice things about social justice. This is why. I think this is what happened. In the last century, these liberals, American liberal, left liberals, came up with an idea of social justice and all these theories of social justice that are roughly social democratic. These were presented to us, these theories of big government, were presented to us as theories of social justice. They are, but not the only kind there could possibly be. What we actually got was just one interpretation. All these, God knows, so many schools of social democratic social justice, but they all share one thing, at least. They share a common disdain for private economic liberty. And they all share that. But we have before us now, perhaps, maybe we can turn to and together what I think of as the undiscovered country. And the undiscovered country, although Thatcher and Hayek, and Reagan too, is something like a way of being together in society, a form of social justice that I call market democratic. It's democratic in that it insists that everybody matters and no one should be left behind who's willing to work. It's market-based, though, for this one reason. Among the most important rights and liberties, among the most basic rights and liberties, are a thick array of private economic freedoms. And it pursues the requirements of social justice by unleashing those economic liberties and by making no bones about being in favor of more wealth. That picks up, if you like, put it this way, this picks up the socialist insight from Marx that formal rights and liberties without stuff is not very useful. But if you've got formal rights and liberties and you've got material stuff, combine them, stir the thing up, and you've got real freedom, thick freedom, positive freedom. So this approach affirms that conception of positive freedom by way of negative freedoms. The value of negative freedoms is to get those positive liberties. And I'll close with this. In my book, I work out a particular account of this, just to show it could be done. I call it free market fairness. A main argument of the book is that, as sort of an exhortation to other people, especially those of you who are free market people under 35, to develop new theories of social justice of your own that try to combine economic liberty and social justice. As I said, I call mine social justice, free market fairness. But people are sometimes giving it a less formal name, social justice American style. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Christopher Arzrouni is editor of opinions at the Danish newspaper Børsen. He also holds a master's degree in political science, and he has worked as a political advisor for the Danish party Venstre for a number of years. In 2005, he published a book titled Completely Undefendable, inspired by Walter Block, where he argued that, among other things, organ trade, narcotics, and firearms should be made legal. He has written and contributed to several books and numerous columns and articles in Danish newspapers, and he's often a guest in Danish television and radio. So it's a pleasure to give the floor to Christopher Arzrouni.
Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. I read your book with considerable interest because it reminded me of my youth. Just as you have recounted your youth, I will recount mine. One day, an old professor that some of you might know, Mogens Blevad, a professor of philosophy, told me that I should be aware of some footnotes in Hayek's works about Rawls, where he mentions Rawls favorably. And this old professor of philosophy said to me that I should be aware that it was the early works of Rawls that Hayek liked, not the latter works. I haven't had time to check whether the account is correct or not, but it was brought back to mind by your presentation and by your book, and I find it a very interesting thing that you try to make a kind of hybrid between Hayekian and Rawlsian concepts, or basically that you try to say that Hayek was some kind of a closet Rawlsian, which I find a bit disagreeable. I will try and use some of your slides in order to make my little reply to you. And what I'm going to try to do is to divide my reply in two bits. One more abstract and one more concrete. The abstract part, in order to find out a little more about your methods and your philosophical positions. And the other part, to find out what does it mean in practice? Which problems do arise? How can we use it in everyday politics? And what do you really mean when you use some of these concepts? Let me start by the abstract part of it. When I read The Constitution of Liberty by Friedrich Hayek, I'm struck by the fact that he actually wants to fight in all three arenas that you have described here, John. He writes in the introduction that although liberty is something that he cherishes just as well as others cherish it, you should be able to convince others of the merits of liberty. So actually, you might say that Hayek starts out in this arena, gives it up quickly in order to try and persuade other people, non-classical liberals or non-libertarians, about the merits of liberty. And he uses the idea that growth of knowledge is important and should be valued by all those who might not necessarily be in favor of liberty as such. When you read other of Hayek's works, you find out that although he doesn't really use the concept of democratic citizen, the way that you described it would be very Hayekian indeed, acknowledging that everyone has goals in his life, and everyone should be able to respect that others have their kind of golden rule concept or Kantian concept that he uses in his works too. So basically, Hayek tries to fight in all three arenas, and I cannot see why all Friends of Liberty shouldn't do that. Why would you confine yourself only to fight in one arena? Shouldn't the worth of your ideas be tested in all three of them? Utility seeking, self-ownership, and the arena of the democratic citizen. And is it really so that there's a mechanic relation between believing in self-ownership and ending up in something else, and believing in democratic citizenship and ending up in something else? You actually said there was not, with regard to democratic citizenship. On the contrary, you start out here and you do it in order to fight for some of your positions that you took with you from the tents and to the igloos. So why wouldn't you fight in all three arenas, as I believe that Hayek does? That's one thing. The other thing is that in your book you are very thorough in describing how Hayek and Rawls agree on the concept of sort of looking at society from behind a veil of ignorance. And it is a nice concept, although it has some problems. The person behind the veil of ignorance, who has to decide which society might be the most fair, will always have prejudices, will always have values ex ante. I cannot see how it is possible to rid yourself of that. I, for instance, am a product of all my prejudices. I'm a product of my upbringing. I'm a product of my stupid ideas. Sitting behind a veil of ignorance, although I wouldn't know what my position in society might be, I'm a little older than 35, but still, I would take with me my prejudices, maybe my aversion to risk with me in deciding what kind of society would be a good society. Whereas others who might be less risk-averse than I would come to another conclusion. And so thinking about these similarities between Hayek and Rawls, I asked myself, why not read what the old master himself said about it? Not just some more or less superficial comments and footnotes in for instance, legislation and liberty, etc., but his final work. And what does he write? He writes, evolution cannot be just. Indeed, to insist that all future change would be just would be to demand that evolution come to a halt. Evolution leads us ahead precisely in bringing about much that we would not intend or foresee, let alone prejudge for its moral properties. One only needs ask, particularly in the light of the historical account given, what would have been the effect if, at some earlier state, some magic force had been granted the power to enforce, say, some egalitarian or meritocratic creed, one soon recognizes that such an event would have made the evolution of civilization impossible. A Rawlsian world could thus never have become civilized. By repressing differentiation due to luck, it would have scotched most discoveries of new possibilities. In such a world, we would be deprived of those signals that alone can tell each what, as a result of 1,000 changes in the conditions in which we live, we must now do in order to keep up the stream of production flowing and, if possible, increasing. So Hayek does not seem to be a great fan of yes, he doesn't seem to be a great fan of Rawls, and I don't believe that Hayek would try to pull down some kind of frame of social justice over society, be it social justice in a very thin version of the Rawlsian concept. I don't believe that, because he is open to the concept that natural unfairnesses might be beneficial to society as such, and some of the examples that he uses in the Constitution of Liberty is, for instance, the well-off, eccentric young man choosing to build airplanes in the birth of aviation, or build automobiles in the birth of automobile cars. These people being considered eccentric, doing stupid things with inherited wealth, but even so producing new knowledge that will eventually benefit everybody. And when I read your book, when I read your book, I came across a little passage that that bothers me a little bit, because in all its fairness, it actually gives rise to some problems. I think it's page 69. You discuss structural inequalities, for instance, in the same way as one would discuss somebody starting a game of Monopoly with more money than others. Although I fully understand that you shouldn't start a game of Monopoly with more money than others, life is not a game of Monopoly. Life is life. I strive every day to give my children more than what other children have. This is a kind of structural inequality, and it grows even more structural when you consider the abilities of parents. I'm not a musician. I cannot play the piano, the violin, or everything. My girls at school have friends whose parents are musicians. They help their children becoming even better musicians. You might look at it from the point of view of a soccer player. There are families of soccer players. The Laudrup family, for instance. Now, third generation is on its way to stardom. You have families of lawyers. You have families of doctors, etc., where looking at it from a jealous point of view, you might say that inequalities are being perpetuated from generation to generation. And that is perfectly correct. But are these inequalities detrimental to society? Are these structural inequalities detrimental to society? I would say no. Of course, I'm sad that I'm not able to teach my daughters how to play the piano, or my daughters how to play soccer, or my boys. But these structural inequalities are nonetheless good in other respects. Why should you try and eliminate such inequalities? So that sums up my first round of questions, and then I have another round of questions, more practical, that we might come back to before leaving the floor to the audience.
Well, John, would you like to reply to that, but in consideration of time, maybe a not too lengthy reply?
So, when Chris and I just met before when he came to the room, he told me that he was not a philosopher and just read the thing kind of quickly. Whenever a critic tells me that they didn't have much time to read the book, I always get a little nervous, because it means they actually did a really good job. So that was really good. Those were fantastic criticisms. Get right to the big one about Rawls and Hayek. Yes, you're right. When Hayek says these things, these Rawlsian model will stunt people's growth and will lead us to a backwards place, that's correct. Hayek, of course, rejects Rawls' conception of social justice. Because recall, Rawls' conception of social justice, when he runs the unoriginal position, what he gets is this social democratic account of social justice, which is backwards, which does stunt people's lives, which does deny the importance of private economic liberty. Rawls thinks that justice is available, maybe only available, in a fully socialized economy. He thinks that a liberal democracy should be socialist. There should be public ownership of the means of production. Hayek is right, and market democracy agrees that insofar as Rawls himself interprets social justice the way he interpreted it, he must be wrong. He has to be objected to and fought against. So, yes, Hayek would reject Rawls' theory of social justice. I reject it too. The big division, though, is between the sort of general approach to the idea that there's something like social justice out there, and then the particular interpretations that I call just Jack. Rawls's students call him Jack, and there was a famous review of when he died calling him just Jack because he's so just. But I do it the other way, merely Jack. It's merely Jack's interpretation of it. There's that's just Jack, that stuff, but the general idea could be affirmed by all of us. And crucially for Hayek, a really important thing that Christopher said, I think, that line, the first part of the line that you quoted, evolution cannot be just or unjust. That's where the action is. Because there's a reading of libertarianism, Nozick's reading probably, that Hayek rejects at a crucial point. And that divide between classical liberals and libertarians is on this issue. It's the big one. And for those of you who are kind of like looking for, or trying to work out whether you're a radical capitalist individualist, a market anarchist, or a classical liberal, the divide's kind of here. On the anarchist side, evolutionary processes can be just all the way through because they evolved. So according to Nozick, principles of justice are purely historical. If we follow the process, and if the process involved no violations of property rights, then whatever emerges at all is ipso facto just. Get that, though, right? This is Mises' view to some degree as well. But get a hold of that and be sure you want it. So on that idea, it is the process of exchanges that consecrates the product of distribution. Whatever distribution emerges through free exchanges is going to be just. You might like that, but be sure you can sleep with it. Is it really the case that free exchanges will always yield a situation that you're willing to say, yeah, that's just? Could there be conditions in the world, racism, sexism, other kinds of things out there, that generate situations where things go wrong, morally wrong? Hayek's idea, in his early moments, and Rawls' idea too, but alas, not as good, is that in fact, along with respecting evolution, and having humility about not trying to figure it all out and impose it on the world, there can be some process-independent standard of evaluation. There can be something like a way of reasoning, a general way of reasoning that we can use to try to figure out what a just society would look like. Hayek says, if you reason this way, you will find that the great society, a society of spontaneous order, a society that allows people to be free, is the most just society. It's not just simply because it evolved, though. It's just because it satisfies this external standard. It's not just the people on the left who can think this. They have no right to claim to be the only people who care about justice this way. Classical liberals can say this too. And it was part of the classical liberal tradition from the very beginning to care about the poor. Adam Smith was fundamentally concerned about the poor. One of the great strengths of market society and of limited government, before we got on this wrong term of libertarianism, of a certain kind of libertarianism, was exactly that. We emphasized how important economic freedom is to self-development of all people who are willing to work. I think we should get that back. Is that an answer? I don't know. It's part of an answer.
Okay. I think, could we just take a round of questions, and then Christopher, you could both stand up, and questions can address both of the speakers, and in consideration of time, maybe make the questions and comments not too long. And we have a first comment here, and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Michael. It's fascinating, John. I haven't read it, so in fairness, it's difficult for me to criticize it. However, it seems to me that, John, that you have been in academia for so many years, and you're getting annoyed with all these leftist people, and in order to communicate and have a dialogue with them, you have just, augmented this phrase social justice, because then I'm actually invited into their sphere and room, and then I will have my Troican horse, and it will jump out. And that is basically, and that's the core argument, that you have your logistic in place with market economy, that you will always be able to beat them with that. So you chose that position. You could have chosen Nozick's position instead, because of course he have all his contemplation about justice as well, and what is justice, but he also end up with this clause saying that, well, if a catastrophe will happen, then we might do something about this justice system as well. I mean, there's a way out, even for Nozick. Why didn't you chose that instead?
Yeah, I know that worry, and I'll just add this to it. On Facebook, I use Facebook for professional purposes. So if any of you are interested in these issues, Facebook friend me, and I'll say yes, because I just use Facebook for working through bleeding heart libertarianism. Just before I came over here, I checked my Facebook, and the most recent comment someone wrote on some question I'd asked about something or other about this research project. Someone who I'd never heard of just blasted me on just those terms. He said something like, "I can't stand these brown-nosing, bleeding heart libertarians. I want to pound them and make them bleed." It's like, this is like in the context.
That was what I meant.
But it was in the context of a conversation about the principle of non-aggression, and I made some comment about it. Anyway, no, it's not true. Or rather, it was once true, but it's not anymore. Early on, when I first started thinking this stuff 5 years ago, I thought of myself as engaging in a kind of Trojan horse trickery. And originally, the book was called originally the idea was to show that social justice could be used both ways, and that was all I was going to do. It was only when I actually got into the project that I came to see that, in fact, and I believe, that the most attractive way to defend classical liberalism, the best arguments for the limited government that I admire, is the democratic argument. So I'm all in for social justice, not just because it gives me coinage with my fellow academics. On the contrary, in the old days, when I was just a stand-up libertarian and we're talking about Nozick, they were happy with me. They thought I was just fine because they knew they could deal with me. They've beaten those 6 arguments so many different times. They having me say it again, that's very comfortable. Now, when I go into the rooms and I say, yeah, I'm one of you, and by the way you do it, it's morally better if you do it my way, they get very upset. So I was at Stanford a few days ago. There's a guy named Josh Cohen, who's Rawls' big, and that was uncomfortable. Because if you're on the inside, you may get the coin to let you get into the room. But once you're in there, they see it. It's a much bigger threat to the view if you're sharing the premises and are sincerely arguing them through. And I am sincerely arguing them through. I think we owe it to one another to seek institutions that leave no one behind who's willing to work. And I think limited government are the institutions that do that. I think the transitions that happened in the Nordic countries in the last 30 years, while looking at the barrel of an economic gun, were not merely required for economic reasons, they're morally better. Sweden got morally better as it starts to marketize. Anders Borg's changes he's starting there, those are not simply economic compromises. Those aren't compromises with morality. Those are fulfillments of a better understanding of morality. It's a better world. The more you people leave social democracy in the 1970s behind, the more you marketize done the right way, the better, the morally better it is.
But actually, why would you have to go through social democratism of the 70s in order to come here? Because, for instance, Danish society, and probably in some respects you might know that, Mikael, Swedish society was free and fair already in the 20s, 30s, 40s, with a public sector that was smaller than the United States, with a tax burden that was smaller than the Anglo-Saxon countries.
Yes.
And
why was it swept away? What set of ideas wiped it out?
Social democratism.
Yeah, exactly.
Swept it away.
Exactly. Why? So Hayek's essay, The Intellectuals and Socialism, explains why. Hayek says you can't just have a model that works. You have to have a moral understanding of the model. And if you have a well-functioning great society, a la Sweden, 1930 maybe, 20s, that without the moral ideas behind it to hold it in place, so you understand it's not just happens to be fair, it's fair and we affirm it as fair, it's liable to be swept away by some ideology. That's what happened for much of the Western world. Socialism rose up, and the only answer, which is kind of, I'm sorry to say, lame stuff about economics, which didn't always look very attractive when the markets weren't working very well. You need to have a moral argument that can go all fours with their moral argument. You have to have a moral account of fairness, not just in the back door, but right up front. So I think that's the Hayekian. Hayek says in that essay, The Intellectual Socialism, you need to make the quest for a free society a living cause that can attract young people of energy to make it ever new again. And I think these theories don't do it. I also want to say, by the way, you said, why don't you just go back and forth on these three like Hayek does? That's the worst part of Hayek. I mean, Hayek does go back and forth, but that's why philosophers don't take him seriously. Because if he goes back and forth, sometimes they point different directions. If you want to be a self-owner, but you also want to do social justice, well, they often will conflict. So you can't just go back and forth among all three, arguing here, arguing there, because at some point you're going to need to say, well, which is your foundational value? Without that, it'll just be picking and choosing, and it won't be convincing
Actually,
anyone.
I completely disagree with you.
Fair
because it is...
not just partially?
No, completely. Because it is as if you demand of us to make a clean slate and then choose a principle to build a philosophy upon.
Yeah.
Whereas I see the Friends of Liberty, if
Yes.
you could use that as the
Yes.
big tent.
Yes.
The Friends of Liberty are reformists. They always start with an existing society, pointing out at what does not work, trying to make it better.
Yes.
It isn't
Good.
a radicalism that
Good.
starts with a clean slate,
Good.
which is
I like that.
which is why it will be very difficult to point at an ideal system. You always say we have to make sure that nobody's left behind.
Yeah.
The
Who wants
problem
to
is
work?
somebody will always be left behind. We can minimize that, but there is no solution once and for all to that problem. I think it's a problem of philosophers' belief in rationality, that just because there's a problem, there's always a solution. There might be problems that have no solutions.
Agreed. But if I...
Okay.
So,
Can I interrupt here? Just in consideration of time, let's just have the last 2 or 3 questions, and then because this could probably continue and continue. There's one here.
Yes, my name is Axel, and I'm past the border of 35. So I hope you have me excused, but could you please explain for me, an old butcher, because I hate the phrase social justice. Yeah. I really get sick when people talk about social justice, because I'm brought up in this socialist society where the force of power are stealing my money every month, and only left some pocket money left for me and my family. I'm some stupid reason I haven't moved to the US or Switzerland.
Getting worse there.
Yeah. Oh. So, how do you? I really don't get what is social justice if it's not stealing my money and giving to some bastards who don't want to work.
So,
wait, just before you answer, let's just lump together 3 questions, and then that'll be the last 3 questions for today.
Thank you. My name is Emil, and I'm an undergrad in political science. And I would like to ask, you gave this example with Margaret Thatcher, and we have this justice and then this justice, and that's how we measure social justice over time. And the model makes perfect sense, except one of these will always be counterfactual, because you cannot have both. You will either have this society over time or this society. So how can we say if this is better than this, if this actually is up here and this is down here? I don't see how that actually gives you a good measuring stick of social justice.
Yeah.
Okay, just the final question.
What was the first one? Oh, social justice.
Thank you. So I'm a bit curious as to how much of your argument rests on economic theory, if you will. So you were describing, or am I sure? Hi. So you were describing how if you compared 2 societies, one having the free forces of the markets unleashed, if you will, and the other one being a more Rawlsian society, how through time you would find that the free market society would move the worst off into a better position over time than in the Rawlsian society. Now that seems to me, if I understand you correctly, that seems to me to be quite a contingent claim. I mean, that seems to rely heavily on free markets actually being far more efficient than more socially controlled markets. And to the best of my knowledge, there's no consensus among economists saying that, well, you would definitely find that over time the free markets would make the worse off better off than the more politically controlled economy.
Good, thank you. It's a really important question. So I'll answer the second 2 questions together, then return to social justice. About the ideal and the counterfactual, that's quite right. When they're always going to be, we go for this one, and we never saw this one actually turned out to be. You go for this one, we never saw this one either. You only get the one you actually try for. The crucial bit, though, is that what philosophers are doing is, what do you aim at? What's your? I think of these moral philosophies as being like stars up in the sky. The societies use to orient themselves by, and they try to move their societies towards justice. They may never actually get to justice. That's the star up in the sky, but they look at these philosophical ideals and they orient themselves to kind of become like that. In the U.S. right now, we have a president who has this very clear vision of the star in the sky, which was twinkling above Sweden in 1970. I think he genuinely believes that we move America, this whole gargantuan colossus, towards that star and make America more like he thinks 1970 Sweden was, it'll be more just. The key bit, though, is that what philosophers are doing is thinking about what's the twinkling star? Which twinkling stars is most probably attractive? And my thought is that if you think about all these economic regimes on a continuum, from the most socialist to sort of mixed socialist to sort of welfare state to minimal state to anarchist society, most people think that the moral winds blow in that direction. They blow from the right to the left. That's what they all think. Morally speaking, if we could get to this ideal of socialism, that's where we should go. My thought, in fact, is that the opposite. The moral winds blow this way. If you want to know where the twinkling stars are, it's something about those ideals of the minimal society for reasons of fairness. That does involve empirical assumptions, a whole bunch of them. And the book mixes comedy, attempts at comedy, with political philosophy, with some history too. And the brief version is that if the societies on the left, the ideals on the left, do not aim at growth, and most of them don't. Rawls's does not, Keynes's does not, Mill's does not. They deny that as an ideal. The moral ideal is something like a stationary state. That opens the ground for the possibility of a form of social justice which is explicitly enthusiastic about growth. Private economic liberties are the core liberties that I care most about. Then there's some really more tactical questions about filling in the rest of the economic picture. I think that some versions, sort of straight classical liberal reasoning, can be plausibly said to promote growth. However, if you need some tweaks here and there along the way, some classical liberal tweaks, there's space in the theory for that. The key bit, though, as a moral matter, is that we owe our fellow citizens private economic liberty, even if it does not help growth. It's a moral matter that we owe this to our citizens, first and foremost. Hopefully it leads to growth as well. Social justice. I hear you. Hayek says, he compares the phrase social justice to the phrase a moral stone. A society can't be just or unjust. All that's just is individual actions. What you do, what I do, what people intend can be just or unjust. But no one intends the whole shape of society. So Hayek thinks that the society itself is a spontaneous order. No one knows the exact shape of it. He distinguishes two kinds of social order, cosmos and taxis. A taxis is a made order, where mind is, like you were saying, there's a mind in a theory that says, okay, we're going to put all its pieces in its part, like a great big Lego model of the Death Star, and we sort of put the pieces together, like the picture on the box, and there it is, ta-da, we built society. That's intentional. Something intentional like that, society of that sort, could be called just or unjust. But the free society is not like that. The free society emerges and grows through the countless decisions that individuals make, and no one can predict what they're going to be. If people are truly free, they're going to grow. Society's going to grow in unpredictable, like the rock candy, clusters of crystals on a rock candy string. Those, do you get some rock candy strings? I don't know. It's kind of childhood candy. These things just grow by the way the individual molecules interact with one another. Here's the key bit, though. The spontaneous order, no one intended that sugar candy crystal to look exactly the way it does. No one could possibly know what it would be like. Still, from a one-step back Hayekian perspective, we can tell good candy from bad candy. And we can even become more sophisticated makers of candy. We can be advocates of spontaneous order who become aware through time of how it is that we encourage the formation of the best candy crystals. Hayek himself thought that spontaneous order sometimes required that we think about the rules that emerge and evolve and tweak them in certain ways towards our purposes. What are our purposes? Well, those are the things that we decide. Social justice, that means, can apply not just to structures which are planned in their absolute entirety, like the Lego model of the Death Star. Intentionality also seeps through the process of creating really excellent rock candy. There's a science of candy making. This essential feature is it's respectful of the elements. It's respectful of the molecules, the people, the human beings who are living their lives there. It does not seek to boss them around. In fact, it refuses to boss them around. It empowers them to be free and to grow as they might want to grow. But there can be a science of that that's gentle, that has humility, that does not fall into the fatal conceit, does not always try to seek through the back door to turn our society into a Death Star, rather sees the possibility for peaceful, voluntary interactions that leave no one behind. So social justice can be thought of that way. And, they shouldn't get the term. They shouldn't get it. Hayek was wrong to make us think we couldn't take it. We can take it and make it new again. Like the Robin says, we can make it new. That's poetry, I guess.
I think that will be the last word. Thank you so much for coming,
thank you.
John and Christopher. Let's give them a big hand.